So good morning, everybody. Have you ever read a book and you had sort of this eureka moment about where all of a sudden everything sort of becomes clear in some area that you've never even known you were lacking? This is what this message is about for me. I read this book called The Blood Covenant quite a few years ago, and I've reread it. And all of a sudden, the whole, my understanding of what Jesus did and our unity with him was just really quickened. So I want to share that with you today, and it's actually going to be a two-part message, part one today and part two next week. So my message today is titled The Blood Covenant. And there are going to be a few rites and practices I'm going to describe that we may feel a little uncomfortable with, okay, because it's to our North American ears. But I want you to sort of hear what the Spirit is behind it. So it may be a little difficult at times, but just bear with me because I just want to set up this base for next week. So first of all, I want to talk about what is a covenant. Okay, it's similar to a contract in that it's an agreement, but it's not the same. Okay, it's, for instance, these are just some of the differences. A contract is a legal agreement, right? But a covenant is more of a spiritual agreement. A contract is more limited, and it actually becomes invalid. When one person breaks it, that's it. But it's not the same with a covenant. If someone breaks it, it still stands, okay? It's a perpetual agreement. It will remain intact. So in a covenant, you still hold up your promise even if the other person doesn't. That's the idea behind it. It's a trust-based promise, okay? So it relies on your integrity, discipline, your values, and it is a lasting commitment, a long commitment, okay? It's not just a short term. And in the Bible, we see many examples of covenant, right? That's how God relates to his people. And mainly this is a blood covenant, okay? And I'm going to explain a bit more about that. And this is the type of covenant that we have with Jesus. That's how we relate to him. It's a blood covenant. And I just want to show you, I'll show you here. Let's see. So I want to look at this, wait a second here. Sorry, I'm just going to move this over. There. So this is in Luke, chapter 22, 19 to 20. And you'll recognize this as the Last Supper. And he, that's Jesus, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." So that's a statement of the new covenant by Jesus himself. Okay, that's the blood covenant he made with us. And that's how we're connected with him. That's how we are made one with him. And so as we walk through a bit of what this blood covenant is, I'm hoping that you're going to sort of always have in the back of your mind, how am I connected to Jesus? Okay, so this, hopefully you'll sort of see this even as I saw going through this book and seeing what he did for us. Because it's not just about him taking away our sins. It's about our unity with him, okay? Our identity in him. So as I said before, this first part is going to be about that. We're going to set up some foundations and context of what the blood covenant is. And then next week, I'm going to go into more about specifically God's covenant with his people and the new covenant Jesus has with us and what that implies. So my main reference, of course, is the Bible. And also this book, I showed you, called The Blood Covenant. It's by a man named H. Clay Trumbull. Okay, now he lived in the 1800s, and he wrote this book in 1885, and he updated it in 1893. Okay, and to write it, he researched all sorts of records. He researched historical records, archaeological records, travel records even, and even folklore, and even interviewed some people who had direct contact with different blood covenant practices. And he recorded this all in he recorded the observations and findings in this, and he was a Christian minister too. Okay, so this book is actually available online. If you do want to read it, I can give you the link. It's free. I think it's because it's so old, but it's very good. So I think right now we got to understand what does the blood covenant mean in the Bible when it was written? Okay, now this is important because it can't mean something different now than it did at that time. It can be, we can have greater revelation of it, but it can't be different, okay? And we live in a very different world now, obviously, than when it was written. Different cultures, different figures of speech, different practices. So some things we're just going to miss just because we don't understand that particular context. Okay, and even when it was written, there were certain practices and certain maybe stories that people understood. You didn't have to explain it all, so it wasn't written in the Bible, but we don't have all that background. So it's important to try and figure out what it was, so when we read it, we have greater understanding. And that's the case with the blood covenant, okay? So I want to try and convey some of that context to you today. Now, most of us don't really understand the implications of blood covenant. It sounds kind of barbaric, pagan to our North American ears, right? We don't want to talk about stuff like that for whatever reason. It's not something we say or talk about in mainstream society, but there are elements and symbols of it we see every day. And one of those examples is the wedding ring. That's an example, a sign of a blood covenant. Now I want to go to a quote from Trumbull. This is the author of this book, okay? And this is something he wrote based on all his research. He said, a covenant of blood, a covenant made by the intercommingling of blood, that's the combining or sharing of blood, has been recognized as the closest, the holiest, and the most indissoluble compact conceivable. That's really strong language. See, I underlined a few words because I'm the closest. So no other covenant is closer than this particular covenant. The holiest. Blood is not defiling. It's purifying. Most indissoluble, okay? Remember we talked about being perpetual? And if it is broken, there are consequences, okay? It's not easily broken. And it's a compact, okay? So there's more than one person involved. So those are some of the characteristics. So from right now, I want to start now with an example, an illustration of a basic blood covenant rite, okay, and the implications, and this is about blood brotherhood. So I'm going to describe to you something that was described to Trumbull about somebody who actually observed a certain rite. Okay, and this is an ancient Syrian rite that was still in practice in the 1800s. When the book was actually written. But it gives the same elements that you see throughout ancient times. So this was between two people who wanted to join in blood brotherhood, okay? So they do it in the presence of witnesses. It wasn't something done behind, without anybody around. The two men announce what their purposes are, okay? They want to enter into blood covenant with each other. And they each take it and they write it down on a piece of paper. They sign it, and then they make a copy. So there's two copies. Then one takes a knife and makes a cut in the one person's arm, and they take a quill, and they partake a little bit of the blood. Then they take the quill, the end, and they take the blood on the end of the quill, and they mark it on their little part of the covenant, the little document they wrote. And the other person does the same thing to them. Then they stand and they make a declaration together, okay? That they are making a covenant together before God. And they also declare an ultimatum, that if one deceives the other, God will deceive him. So there's consequences for deceiving the other person. And then they take this little blood-stained covenant document, and they fold it all up, and they sew it in a leather case or put it in an amulet, and they put it either around their neck or around their arm. And they would wear that. It'd be a permanent sign of their blood brotherhood. So I just want to go through a few of these main characteristics again. Okay, first of all, it's a mutual agreement. It's not forced upon somebody, okay? It's done in the presence of witnesses. They both make declarations of their intent, but they also speak out the ultimatums, okay? The curses if it's broken. And then they always have a symbol or a sign. And in this case, it was the amulet around their arm. Okay, a way that they can remember this covenant. And there has to be blood, okay? You can't have a blood covenant without blood, right? There has to be a sharing in some way, shape, or form, whether it's actual or later on we're going to talk about symbolic. Now, this particular blood covenant, it is forever extremely close. It's actually closer than a natural sibling. I want to take you to Proverbs 18:24, and you probably know this one. The scripture says, "A man of many companions may come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother." This is blood covenant language. This is exactly what blood brotherhood is about. Now, people in blood covenant are so close to a point that in the Bible lands, the Middle East, okay, people who entered into this blood brotherhood, a man in blood brotherhood with another could not marry the sister of the person they entered into covenant with because it would have been considered incest. That close. It's extremely binding to the point of dying for each other. Remember what Jesus said in chapter 15, he said in John 15, he says, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone lays down his life for his friends." He was ready to die. That is blood covenant language. That's also the type of covenant you see between Jonathan and David. Okay, remember, and it's in 1 Samuel 18, right? It talked about when Jonathan saw David, his soul was knit together. Okay? It was knit together. And he loved him like his own soul. They became one, right? They became one. It's like one life and two bodies. And they were knit together. It's not just a joining like a gluing. They were knit together. So the parties involved, they've taken on each other's life. They've bound their natures together. And so to be clear, all this blood covenant, it wasn't about the declarations. It was all about the sharing of blood. Now we're going to look at just a couple of components here. By the way, partway through, we'll take a little break because the message is a bit long today. So first of all, I want to talk about the blood. Why the blood? Okay? In the Bible, the concept of blood tied to life is very clear. Genesis 9, verses 3 and 4, it says, this is God talking to Noah after the ark was landed, okay? He says, and he was talking about what he could eat. He says, "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood." Okay, and also we can go to another scripture here. Leviticus 17:11. And this is, of course, God giving Moses all the rules and regulations. He says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement by the life." So with a sacrifice or offered blood, it's not so much about death as it is about life. And God is the one who declares this, okay, this connection of blood and life. This isn't some sort of man-made idea. This is God declaring it. So we know it's true. And so the rites of blood brotherhood, in these rites, the offering again of blood to the other person, of the sharing of the blood, is about giving one's life, very nature, to the other person. Okay, that is the understanding. Now, I found this interesting. Trumbull, he suggests that this may be the reason why Abel's sacrifice was more acceptable than Cain's. Remember, Abel, he sacrificed an animal like a substitute, and so he was proffering the blood. So it was seen as an offering of his very life. But Cain, he just offered a nice gift. So you can see how the blood ties into this particular idea. That was just his thought. I thought it was probably a good reason. Now, another component of blood covenant is the sign of the covenant. Remember, we talked about in the rite how they had the sign of the covenant around their arms that they wore all the time. In other cultures, as Trumbull did his research, he saw this type of sign in many, many blood covenants, okay? And they were always often similar. You see armlets, bracelets, rings. Remember we talked about the marriage ring? And that's actually believed to be why the marriage ring is a sign of blood covenant, okay? And also, it's the root behind the use of a signet ring. You've heard of a signet ring, right? The leaders made their seal with their signet ring. You see this in with Joseph and Pharaoh. Remember, Pharaoh gave Joseph his signet ring to use, right? So, because his ring, the Pharaoh's ring, was a sign of his life because it's related to blood covenant, the tie between blood and life. So he was giving Joseph essentially his life and his authority in giving him this ring. So when people heard Joseph speak, it was like they were hearing Pharaoh speak. And also we have another example in the Bible, in Haggai 2:23. Okay. This is in the time of Nehemiah and Ezra. Okay, Haggai the prophet was, the Lord was speaking through Haggai the prophet to the people there. He says, on that day declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord of hosts. Now, Zerubbabel is a typology of Christ. Okay, this is like a picture, a foreshadow of Christ coming. And it's akin to a declaration by the Lord of a union between him and Christ, Zerubbabel. Okay, so you see a connection, and we know this is picturing Jesus. So it points to the idea that the Father and the Son are in union with each other. Okay, it's picturing that the Son will express the life and authority of the Father. Do you see? I hope you see that. Okay, do you guys want to take a stretch for a minute? Just stand up and stretch for a sec. There you go. This is your chance. We're going to keep going. Okay, we're going to keep going. All right? Now, the idea of this blood covenant, it's not just restricted to the people in the Middle East or in the Bible or in the Bible lands, okay? It has actually been seen through groups throughout the whole world, okay, and over the course of time. And in Africa, for instance, you guys, have you ever heard of Dr. Livingstone, Dr. Stanley Livingstone? Okay, so he lived in the 1800s, and he was a Scottish physician and missionary, okay, and he was known for exploration of Africa. He's also the first known European to have traveled the whole continent from west to east, okay, and he and other European visitors, as they went through Africa, they recorded a lot of different blood covenant ceremonies, or they called it blood friendship, okay, in Africa, but it's the same kind of idea. And there they often used it between members of different tribes to secure peace between them. And also the European travelers even used this. So when they came, they were traveling, they come to a tribal land, there were a group of them, they'd say, okay, anybody here have a blood covenant with this tribe we're entering? Because if somebody did in their group, then they could know that they would be welcomed into those tribal lands. They would be safe, they would be fed, they would be all that kind of thing. But if nobody was in blood covenant, they were taking their life in their own hands. And often these European travelers would actually stop and they would make a blood covenant with the tribe in the land that they were entering into. Okay, so this was a way to secure peace, protection, security, and their rights were very similar to the ones that I've described, okay? They had witnesses, they made declarations about what they were doing and the consequence of breaking the brotherhood. They shared blood, often very vigorously, and they exchanged gifts, and they often had a ceremonial or a celebration meal afterward. And the sharing of blood was done in various ways, okay, not just in Africa, but other ways. So they actually partook of it as well, but the other ways that they do it is they'd take a little bit and put it in a common drink, and then they would both drink this drink. And you can see there how the idea of drinking wine as a symbol of the covenant came into being, because at first some people would put blood in the wine and they'd drink it, but later on no blood. And you even see this in ceremonial, in marriages today, in certain ceremonies where the bride and the groom, they take a common cup of wine and they both drink from it. That is the blood covenant sharing that unites them, a union, right there. So there's also a lot of evidence about blood covenanting in all these different cultures. Norse, German, many European peoples, Chinese, Indian, South American, North American, and other people groups, okay? That evidence is everywhere about the importance of blood covenanting. It's also seen in the folklore of many nations, and there's lots of stories about in the folklore as well. And it's not just about giving life. Actually, there's more to it. And I want to just, here's a quote from Trumbull here. He said, blood giving was life giving. I think we've talked about that a lot. Life giving was love showing. And again, think about our relationship with Jesus. Love showing was a heart yearning after union in love and in life and in blood and in very being. That was a primitive thought in the primitive religions of all the world. And this was done, he stated this after a lot of research. Now, there's obviously perversions and corruptions you see in the rite of blood covenanting, but regardless, okay, there was the understanding that partaking some manner of the blood was required to share life and union. Even the use or partaking of blood outside of a blood covenant had this idea of life, okay? And, or of taking on the nature and the life of another person. So even outside of a blood covenant, the taking in of blood. And we see this in healing, okay? And either someone would take someone's blood, either with consent or not, or if it's offered, and they would partake of it, believing it would bring healing. And there's even cases in folklore of people bathing in blood. And there's a recorded example of King Louis XI of France. In 1483, he actually drank the blood of young children because he was ill, and he believed it would give him healing. Again, these kind of things sound barbaric to our ears, but think about the idea behind it, okay? And there's other examples in other cultures. And this was outside of a blood covenant, but it's the understanding of blood and life. And even the idea of taking on the nature of another person through taking blood. There's examples right here in the history of Canada. Okay, and again, some of these examples I'm going to give you is a bit maybe gruesome to us, but I want you to think of what the understanding is here. Anybody heard of Jean de Brébeuf? Okay, he was a missionary, a Jesuit missionary to the Huron Nation in the late 1500s, early 1600s. Okay, and so he was in Canada here. And what happened to him, his death, he was captured by an enemy tribe, and he was subjected to terrible torture and death. Terrible, terrible, if you read about it. But the enemy tribe so admired his courage throughout all this ordeal that when he died, they took of his blood and even his heart, because they believed the heart was the fountainhead of blood and life. Okay, again, it sounds terrible for ours, but they believed so much they would take on his nature and his courage through doing this. All right? And there are examples of that in other cultures around the world as well. So the point of all this is that the nature of blood and blood covenant is in the giving of life was a universal understanding. It was not just in the Bible, it wasn't just at Bible times, and the Bible was not written to show this, but it was written within the context of blood covenant all around them, okay? So the understanding was there when the Bible was written and amongst the people. And that makes sense, right? Because God is the creator. He created everything, okay? He's the one who said life is in the blood. So it shouldn't come as any surprise somehow that everybody kind of intuitively knows, or the people intuitively knew that blood and life were tied together, even if their rights were corrupted or perverted. And actually, I just want to tell you a little story here about this understanding. One of the times when I was in Israel, I was with a tour group, and I was in the lobby, and I was talking to one of the gentlemen in the lobby there, and he was telling me about his testimony about how he came to Christ. And he was saying, like, before he even thought of Jesus, he was searching for something more powerful, something more than him. And he was thinking, he said he didn't know exactly what it was, but one thing he did understand, that it needed blood. I thought, whoa, I've never heard that before. But it's true. He understood correctly. There was an intuitive understanding that blood was required. And the good thing is that he picked Jesus, right? So we've looked at this desire and practice of sharing one's life with another person, right? Blood brotherhood, and even in marriage, okay? Now, in marriage, by the way, with this with this whole idea of blood covenant, that's why the uniting, like when one of the spouses dies or you're divorced, that's why it's not just a break, it's a tearing, it's a pulling apart. And that's why things like that are so painful, okay? And that's even in blood brotherhood, if someone's joined and they come apart. It's a tearing, it's not just a dividing. So it's a very, very strong pull, okay? A very, very strong bond. But there is a union that people desire even greater than with another person. And that's the desire of a person to share in the very nature and life of one's God. A person-divine union, a human-God union. And from the beginning of time, people have sought to enter into this union with their God, either for power, for love, for wisdom. And it's essentially to take on the very nature of their God, to show devotion, to be one with their God. Okay? But how would this blood covenant be accomplished? How do you share blood with a God? Is that possible? Well, we know it is. And that is where that practice of substitutionary sacrifice comes in. And in some ancient cultures, you see where it's a human sacrifice, like the Aztecs and the Incas, but then we also, of course, see an animal sacrifice, a substitutionary sacrifice. And we see this in the example of Abraham and Isaac. Remember, he was going to go sacrifice his son, but God gave him a ram as a substitute. And even we see that when we talked about Abel's offering to God was through a substitute, right? That whole concept. And this rite required that an animal was used that was acceptable to the parties. It couldn't just be any animal. Both parties had to have be accepting of whatever the sacrifice was. And especially the God had to accept this particular animal that they were going to use. And that gives understanding to all those rules that God gave to the Israelites in Leviticus about the sacrifice, what they could have, what they couldn't have, all the specifics. It's not because he wanted to lord over them, it's because he wanted to enter covenant with them. So he wanted it to be an acceptable sacrifice. Now, in this type of sacrifice, it's the shedding and the pouring out of blood, typically on the altar. That's the means of the union between man and God. Okay? And so the process was not seen so much as the death of the sacrifice, okay, but the giving and receiving of life. So blood, again, was not about death, it was about life and life-giving. And then afterwards, the animal was typically eaten. We see that in the Bible. And it was like a ratification, okay? It was like an acceptance of the belief that, yes, we have entered union with our God, and it was a covenant meal. It was remembering just what happened. And that's very clearly illustrated in the covenant that God made with the Israelites on Mount Sinai. And I will probably look at that next week. Okay, they had a covenant meal before their God afterwards. So I'm just going to give a bit of a summary now. Okay, and this is about the universal convictions and understanding of blood covenant, okay, and its practices. So first of all, again, life is in the blood. Okay, the two are intricately tied, and that was declared by God. It's not man who decided this. The next thing is that blood sharing brings a union of natures and life. Okay, and with the divine human, it was generally through substitution, and it is like a knitting together. Okay, it's not just gluing together; it's a knitting together. It's extremely binding. It's greater than natural bonds, okay? Greater than the bonds between natural siblings. Okay, that the offering of one's blood to another is offering your life, your love, and your nature. And therefore the receiving is taking on the life, the nature, the love of the other. That the human divine union is the highest desire that men have sought after from primitive times to today. It's an eternal desire and a goal, and it's only achievable through blood. I don't know if I have one thing after. Oh. So, and also we also see with respect to a covenant meal or a symbol, okay? The covenant meal was a ratification. There's also symbols, which are constant reminders of the covenant that someone is a part of. And it also indicates a belief in the union, the success of the union between the two covenanters. Now, I'm going to go over this next week briefly again, because this is setting the stage for looking at our covenant with Jesus, right? The new covenant with Jesus, and also God's covenants with his people. So you probably have made a lot of connections even today, I'm hoping. But we needed to do this so you can understand the context, and I hope it will give you a greater understanding of how solid our bond is with Jesus. So thank you.